and welcome to another episode of the Deep Dive Podcast. My name is Cliff, and I am the Senior Director of New Business Development at EyeSee. Today's conversation will be all about adopting a category growth mindset and paying attention to its enablers, like consumer experience, assortment, merchandising, etc. Across the globe, most CPG categories are having structural challenges with assortment, not only because we live in a post-pandemic world, but also because intensifying competition constantly keeps elevating things to a new level. In the US, for example, a whopping 83% of SKUs in pet care contribute to less than 2% of overall category sales. This points to the glut of non-performing products and variations that exist in this category alone. The same can be seen across other key categories, such as household care at 79% and alcohol at 78%, showing that this is not an isolated incident. So there are many questions to be asked. Where should we look for opportunities for sustainable growth? Which insights gaps need addressing? And why is it very difficult or even not advised to speak about assortment without including category context, without looking at the whole shelf, so to speak? Fortunately, today I have two experienced experts by my side, one of whom is Oksana Sobol. She is the insights lead at the Clorox Company, an experienced professional with global expertise in market research, strategy, and innovation. She specializes in consumer insights, category insights, analytics, new product development, product marketing, product portfolio management, marketing strategy, and the list impressively goes on. Welcome, Oksana.
Thank you for having me, Cliff. I'm glad to be here to discuss this, as you mentioned, challenging, but I will add also very exciting topic.
Exactly. This is a very exciting topic that simply requires unique solutions. Also joining us today is Morana Kristek, New Business Development Director at EyeSee with over 20 years of experience leading CI teams. Welcome, Morana.
Happy to be here. It is always so valuable to hear about unique experiences and problem-solving approaches from a person coming from the producer side. So once again, Oksana, thank you so much for being here.
So before we begin, let us first examine some common industry myths before delving further into this topic. We need to make sure the water is clear before diving in deeper, right? All right, let's start with a simple one. A positive concept test result will translate into consumer preference on the shelf. What's your take?
Well, this is why we're here today, to highlight that shelf context introduces a plethora of new variables that can significantly modify or even reverse consumer choice. We've all heard of the famous Tropicana example, where they changed the design so much that consumers couldn't recognize it and couldn't find it anymore. In EyeSee, we have many examples as well, for example, in the pet food category, soups, or OTC. Here we must think about things such as shelf organization, labeling and signage, adjusting product influence, prominence, and packaging. Imagine if you were selling low-calorie product and it was placed right next to a delicious high-calorie snack. So this could be tremendously confusing for consumers, not to mention the effect on purchase or brand image.
Yes, I have certainly seen examples in practice when consumer reaction, if you obtain it to a concept or product in isolation, just does not track once it's placed into a shelf context or a real-life retail environment. Examples include sourcing from a different set of products than you intended or the concept test would have suggested, or preference for a different type of packaging than a product test would suggest. And there's just the overall challenge of breaking through and communicating the essence of your proposition in a pithy way, but on a crowded shelf.
Morana, you've mentioned packaging. So we are aware that marketing managers are often eager to share their opinions related to it. In fact, because it is so tangible, packaging is an area in which many marketers tend to trust their intuition. However, we should be aware of our initial reactions and preferences, as several factors can lead us astray. First and foremost, there's the issue of shelf context, right? So would you say that sometimes it is better not to listen to one's intuition?
Sometimes, definitely. I'm usually a very pro-intuition person, but when we talk about pack design, I'm definitely against listening to intuition. You know, when people view and discuss packaging, they naturally and understandably gravitate towards what is appealing to them. We all like pretty things. But we certainly want to avoid packaging that is ugly or offensive. However, the most aesthetically pleasing design is not necessarily the most effective one. In fact, research has often found that it is far more important for packaging to quickly and clearly convey a point of difference versus competition, as opposed to just being more appealing. Also, we must never lose sight of behavioral KPIs. For example, visibility and findability. Nice packaging must be noticed before being admired. And consideration and purchase, meaning it's important to understand how many people interact with the product and how. The pack design itself can be really beautiful, but not at all inviting for purchase. For example, it is not fitting the category well, it is sending completely wrong message, it is too similar to other designs on shelf, thus not distinctive.
When you bring up noticeability and differentiation, Morana, an example that comes to mind is what You by Kotex achieved several years ago in the feminine hygiene category. They have chosen to completely buck category convention by launching packaging that was stark black in a category that was conventionally and traditionally pink. In fact, if you think back to those years, that's when black was beginning to emerge as a color used to coat products intended for men in many personal care categories. But it turned out to be a great move, achieving breakthrough and appeal for a younger audience. But the thing is, you just can't know ahead of time how a radical idea like that will play out. It could completely backfire, and we have seen examples of that happening as well. And this just underscores the critical importance of how you test these changes by placing consumers into the right context.
Okay, so now we know that a positive concept test means little without context, and that intuition may not always be right. So on to our next and final myth for today. In the introduction, we mentioned the long tail issue with a few specific category examples. However, if we want to shorten the tail so as to not have a confusing situation for shoppers and potentially damage revenue, should we just delist the product with a low share, as the common belief would suggest?
Well, no, we shouldn't do that. That way you can fall into the trap of overlooking the potential incremental contribution of some so-called long-tail products. To be honest, most of them probably deserve to be delisted, but sometimes you can find a product that has a significant incremental value to the overall portfolio. For example, a niche product that has highly loyal purchasers who wouldn't replace it for the world. It wouldn't be wise to immediately delist such products. So it's not sufficient to just rank SKUs by market share and then delist those below certain percent of market share. One of the analyses that is traditionally used to check incrementality is TURF, Total Unduplicated Reach and Frequency Analysis. A bit complicated name, but rather simple analysis. And useful, I might say. On the other hand, if you want to widen the portfolio, you need to seriously pay attention to how easily purchasers navigate between different offers within the same portfolio. Shelf tests are essential here.
Okay, now that misconceptions out of the way, I suggest we continue with the main course. My first question for you, Oksana, is why is it important to incorporate category context? Someone could argue that it seems like an additional step.
Well, first of all, I think the most successful companies approach both their core brand management and innovation with a category growth mindset rather than strictly a brand growth mindset. If you're only focusing on growing your own brand, what you're doing is you're essentially reallocating category share without contributing anything to the category itself. It becomes this zero-sum game, and that is not particularly appealing from a retailer's point of view either. By contrast, category leaders focus on growing and evolving the entire category. And then secondly, unless real-life store and shelf context is incorporated into the learning plan, we run the risk of launching products or making changes that will not perform in market how we expected from these isolated tests, just like some of the examples we talked about up front. So if you accept these two premises, the question becomes not whether to incorporate context as a best practice, but how to do so systemically and efficiently.
I totally agree. And all of that can be seen in the fact that surprisingly or unsurprisingly, more than 90% of all the innovations fail to break through the clutter. They struggle to gain visibility on the shelf, fail to effectively communicate key performance or emotional benefits. They struggle with poor price positioning or face insufficient or inadequate promotion. While preparing for this conversation, I was thinking about the number of products in an average store. Is it 100, 1,000, 10,000? Well, it seems that a traditional supermarket has from 15,000 to 60,000 SKUs, on average around 40,000. So in our shelf testing, where we analyze about 80% of the representative market share, the typical size of a shelf for mature categories, for example, like household cleaners, chocolate, coffee, or CSDs, is around 300 SKUs. Even within the simplified testing environment, which focuses on one category alone, there are approximately 300 to 400 products competing for attention alongside your product or a new product. And this is why context matters. This is why category managers turn to us for help. They face increasing pressure from retail chains that demand justification and evidence that a new product, new packaging, or new type of display will work. Space on the shelf, and let's be honest, on the floor too, is limited. And retailers not only need to increase sales, but also ensure a satisfying consumer experience in the face of overwhelming choices. We know that if there's too much choice, a shopper will become paralyzed and just walk away. Our action standards always aim for a win-win scenario where a new product or display contributes to overall category growth without jeopardizing, for example, private labels or profitability. Also, it's crucial to differentiate between mature and emerging categories. Mature categories focus on optimizing the assortment, while emerging categories aim to attract new shoppers and grow the category. Consider, for example, the placement of organic beer. Should it be grouped with mainstream beers or positioned in the premium organic product section? Will it be clear to consumers what it is based on the packaging and placement? Should we support the new category with signage? And I'm all talking from experience now. When craft beers emerged, it created such a confusion for consumers with various options vying for attention on the shelf. So it's all about finding the right balance between optimizing the assortment and strategically growing the category, all while ensuring that shoppers can navigate the shelves with clarity and make informed purchasing decisions. And that's why we always test in context in a realistic store environment.
With all that said, it becomes clear that we have to pay attention to multiple things at the same time: the context of the shelf and the context of the category. How can researchers efficiently incorporate shelf and category context into their learning plans?
At Clorox, we call this mindset category leadership. And that can be a big shift if this is something that has to permeate the entire organization rather than just a select group of people dedicated to it. For example, your business planning process might change, where you would start with a vision for your category rather than for your brand. And that means, what are your hypotheses for how the entire category will grow? How will it evolve? What challenges and opportunities must it resolve? Only once you have that kind of clarity can you now formulate your brand plan. And that is essentially, what role will your brand play uniquely in driving your vision of category growth? But then mindset shift is not enough, nor frankly do I think it is achievable without a mechanism. And this is where concrete changes have to be made to mechanisms like business planning process, the way we engage with our retail partners, and critically, the way insight teams support this approach. For instance, from insight's perspective, one would need to lean into capabilities that bring in aisle and shelf context that reflect the real retail environment, be it digital, physical, or hybrid. And this calls for systemic adoptions of these tools and ways of working rather than on an ad hoc basis to really leverage understanding of context and environment and continually test and refine strategic propositions, but without sacrificing time.
I'd say it starts with a mindset shift as well. As you said, companies need to embrace a more holistic approach that goes beyond their own brand. In researcher terms, it means testing everything you can: pack design, displays, MPDs, in context, in a real environment. And when I say real environment, I mean virtual environment, because we test everything in a virtual environment, which has a striking 0.9 correlation with face-to-face shopping. So it's scalable, faster, and definitely more affordable. Going beyond pack, display, and planogram testing here, I would also add running behavioral decision tree studies, and we run them both for brick and mortar and online shopping. And they tell us how people make decisions within the entire category and the importance and hierarchy of decision drivers.
Speaking about decision drivers, what is the impact of shelf or category context on sustainability initiatives? Oksana, as I recall, you mentioned some quite interesting examples during our last conversation when we were chatting about this as part of the preparation for this episode.
You know, sustainability and consumer reaction to it has been one of the most fascinating topics for me to unpack as a researcher, especially from behavioral point of view. What I have observed is that sustainability is an area where the say-do gap is one of the widest, and consumer inertia can be difficult to overcome. For example, this is a space where manufacturers can face the first mover's dilemma, meaning Someone has to be the one to drive positive change, but unless the category follows, there are scenarios where they might get penalized at shelf. Examples may include product compaction, where consumers understand that they're getting the same amount of product if they take the time to read the label or you explain the change to them in a concept. But when they are quickly reacting just to the optics of your size differential versus your competition, they might make a different decision. Or another one, consumers may say that they do not want secondary packaging, but unless it's a category-wide evolution, brands who drop it might suffer from less breakthrough. And then refill models bump up against ingrained consumer perceptions and a whole host of behavior inertia as well. In short, I have seen enough examples of consumers saying one thing when it comes to sustainability, when they interact with the concept or product in isolation, and do another thing when they use heuristic cues to make those split-second decisions at shelf. But the question, of course, is not whether to drive sustainability, it is how. And that's where we've got to bring our full understanding of consumer from what they actually want, which is sustainability, to what's standing in the way of what they want, to how to change perceptions and behaviors to achieve it.
I think we provided a lot of food for thought on context as a crucial component of category leadership. So maybe now we can loosen up a bit and talk about some insights that are personally interesting to us, that arouses our curiosity, makes us think about them once in a while. What is that for you, Morana?
Yes, so I don't know if this is really an insight, but I just can't forget it. Since I first heard of it, I was always smitten by the simplicity of the so-called mom test, or would you show it to your mom? Would you give it to your mom? It is a term commonly used in user experience testing, where the idea is to evaluate a product or a service, more frequently a service, from the perspective of an everyday user. Is it intuitive and user-friendly enough that even someone's non-technical mom, hence the name, can easily understand and navigate through it without assistance or frustration? The mom test helps shift focus from expert assumptions to user-centered approach. So the next time you're working on a product, don't forget to channel your inner mom or dad by putting yourself in the shoes of an everyday user and asking yourself, would you confidently show it or give it to them? Or simply run a usability study with us. That works too.
I enjoy learning from people who are in no way connected to market research because that's where you can borrow and adapt fresh ideas. Just yesterday, I've heard an interview with Tim Ferriss, and that's the author of 4-Hour Everything. He talked about how he researchers were to invest capital to make sure that it's aligned with future trends. So he seeks out 3 groups of people, what he calls the rich, the nerds, and the workaround. And those are his words, not mine. From the rich, he learns about what people broadly will want 5 years from now. So examples like personal assistants that are now broadly integrated as digital artificial intelligence assistants, or electric cars. And then what he calls the nerds, I think of as category super users. They go through unusual amounts of product for sometimes unusual needs. So in the United States, we had this slime trend, and Elmer's glue was set on a new trajectory due to that. And then lastly, when you talk to people who have built elaborate workarounds that involve your products, you learn about category dissatisfiers and white spaces. For example, when I was covering the drain desk at Clorox, we saw a lot of unusual, sometimes funny, sometimes inspiring workarounds and also self-made tools that helped people to unclog their drains.
Oksana, your thought about the workaround actually leads right into my insight. We're all trying to adopt that attitude regarding the cost of living crisis in many different ways. I recently read an article about private label with some interesting statistics. As inflation and higher prices have impacted consumers, 73% of people have acquired a taste for private label brands and plan to keep buying them even as the economy improves. Just 9% that they will not stick with private label options. Additionally, 9 out of 10 shoppers say that they are bargain hunting when grocery shopping. A total of 41% are visiting multiple stores to find the best deals, and cheaper pricing is 4 times more likely to attract shoppers to a store versus just special offers and promotions. Many retailers have stepped up the quality and selection of their private label offerings in recent years, hoping to boost the perception of store brands as marrying good value with higher quality. We know that even prior to the pandemic, consumers were increasingly comfortable with, or sometimes even preferring, private label brands over branded ones. That trend has only gone further with the pricing inflation observed in the past year, Another nudge for shoppers to give private label a shot, if not yet buying. By the way, EyeSee's pricing study regarding inflation is also a topic of one of our previous episodes. Feel free to check it out. So, Oksana, both for Clorox specifically, but also knowing this trend likely affects no shortage of other FMCG companies out there, how do you keep driving value for Clorox's brands over the private label ones?
So Clorox is all about focusing on consumer value. We believe that superior consumer value is the way to drive brand and category growth. And that takes us right back to the central topic of this podcast. If you adopt a category first mindset, you will recognize that in almost any category, there is a role that brands play, and there's also a role that private label plays. So having clarity on which delivers what for consumers and then developing strong hypotheses for their mutual evolution path can be a more generative way to think about growth rather than viewing it as a tug of war between brand and private label.
And with that, another deep dive episode comes to a close. I'd like to thank my colleagues for their time as well as everyone who tuned in. If you enjoyed this conversation and you haven't already, do follow us on YouTube and subscribe to EyeSee Deep Dive on Spotify. In the meantime, join the discussion and share your impressions. Reach out to us with questions or suggest topics for the upcoming episodes. Until next time.